Good. All right. All right. So welcome. So I'll just go over a little bit about myself. I didn't have any slides for myself, but yeah. So I'm Joey. I work at Raymore and Flanagan as a software developer. I am, I guess what you could call a full stack developer. So I do quite a bit of front end in most of my day, but also back end and the middle end, as some people like to call it. I also do some database stuff, kind of all around. My specialty is mostly towards the front end, specifically JavaScript and anything related to that. So that's who I am. A little bit about how I got to where I am at. So I don't have a computer science degree. I taught myself. And then at one point where I was getting really frustrated about 4 years into this, I took a boot camp, just like you're doing now. And after that boot camp, I was hired on over at Raymore and Flanagan. Before that, I worked at the Bank of New York, mostly reporting and business analysis and stuff like that. But when I went home, I would just kind of like hit the book, so to speak, and work towards this. So that's a little bit of background about myself. So don't worry if you don't have computer science background. Today, it's not really absolutely necessary. Like I was mentioning earlier, if you can solve problems and do it via code, people are willing to hire you because they have problems and you have code to solve it. So just a little quick intro about me. This is for you, Jesse. Yeah. All right. So let's just go over a few things here. I want to make sure that we have kind of a baseline of some of the concepts and various JavaScript things that we'll be talking about. How do I do that? Nope. Present. Got it. All right. So actually, before I go into this, I want to just hit up this spreadsheet I started here. So I want to talk about just a few things just to get a feel of where everyone's at. First thing we'll talk about are functions. And we're going to be using functions a lot. If you're writing JavaScript, you're writing functions pretty much all the time, right? So you're not going to get away from it. But functions are great. You can do a lot of stuff with them. They're very powerful, but they can also be kind of confusing at first too. So I wanted to start just by having you go around the room and maybe we'll just describe some things about functions that you know about so that we all I want to see where everyone's kind of at right now. So maybe someone could let me know one thing about functions that they know about functions. Anything.
Name a function and then call it later.
So they can be named. They can be called. Anything else about functions?
You can put a function inside of another function.
Okay, so that is something that's called, functions are first-class objects or first-class citizens. They can be passed as values. Let me write that down. Citizens. It's depending on who you ask, they'll say it differently, but same concept. You can pass it as a value. There are higher order functions. That's a function that returns a function. Yep. Yep. So we have called, invoked. Oh, okay. So they can contain instructions, other code, right? Anything else? They are actually objects. They're a special type of object that can be called. So they also have what's called a signature. That is what the function looks like when you're looking at it lexically. Does anyone here do not know the term lexically? So everyone's here familiar with it or not familiar with it? Okay. So when we talk about things that are lexically laid out in our code, it means how it looks, right? Right. So the word lexicon is kind of like the dictionary, right? It's how you read the code, top to bottom. Yes.
feel like when I just know because when kids learn how to read, right? Like my teacher, so I just associate with like levels of reading, right? So you have to start here before you can get to here, here, and here. So you're at a certain mark level.
Right. So that's right along that concept.
You can have anonymous functions. You can set up some-
Okay. So, yep. They can be named or remain anonymous. I believe that's correct. My spelling's not the best. It's a good thing my variable names aren't spelled right. But they are consistent. So I'm referencing the right one. They also have parameters. And they can take arguments. So when I say parameters and arguments, I mean two different things. They are kind of used, those words are used interchangeably, and that's okay. But when I'm referring to them, the parameters are the, so let me just write it out. So if I say function, my function, and I say arg1, arg2, arg1 and arg2 are local variables to that function. Those are the parameters. So a parameter can receive a value. The argument is the value you pass into the parameter. So when I say argument or parameter, just so semantics, right? So most people just use them interchangeably, and that's fine. I just want to make sure I'm clear.
Parameters and arguments are used interchangeably.
Yes, typically, yep.
Because they are the same thing, or are you saying?
They are technically not, right? So the parameter, like I said, is arg1 here. That is actually a local variable to the function, right? So that can contain a value. The value you put in it is the argument.
So the parameter is the variable and the
Yes.
argument is the value.
Right, so arg1 is the parameter. If I call this function with the parameters 1 and 2, or I'm sorry, with the arguments 1 and 2, I just did it myself. 1 and 2 are the arguments. That's what you pass in. So that's just so when I'm talking about parameters or arguments, you know, I'm just being explicit about it. But you can use them interchangeably.
What is signature, did you say?
Signature is this right here. So function, my function, like the way I'm writing it out, all the way up to the first curly brace, that is the signature.
All the way to the first.
Yep. Let me get this over. Right, so function, my function, open and close parens. Right at that closing parens, that's the end of my signature.
Is the signature the same thing as a declaration, or is that different?
It is the declaration. You are declaring that is what the signature of this function, right? That's what we're going to call it with. That's what it can accept. So if I write two functions called my function, they are differentiated by how they look, basically.
I have something in my notes here, but I'm not exactly sure what I meant by it because it was so long ago. I put down 3 ways: declaration, assignment, and arrow function assignment.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know what the last one means.
We will get into that this week.
Okay.
Yes, that will make sense.
Okay.
I'm not going to go over it right away
Right.
because I'd rather cover the other stuff first.
Right.
Because it'll just, if I cover it first, it'll confuse you. And I don't want anyone to be confused about it. No, you won't miss it. Right?
What's helpful for me, like when I see the words we're learning, which are new, they're not new words, but like
In this context.
right,
Yeah.
like even syntax. Like I use that as away from this field. I use it often, like from my syntax here. It's usually, I write it. So even lexical, or I use the word lexical, but so
Right.
when I see, or when like var, we learned var, what it means. Var. I want to call it var. Isn't it var?
Variable.
Right.
So you want to say var, but most
right,
people say var
right. Yeah.
because you're
no,
looking at only 3
but,
letters.
So you just, what was the concept? The signature. Why is it called, like, it's not obviously my.
I don't know. I didn't come up with the term. I don't know.
No, it's okay. I just wondered if.
I guess you can. I like to think of it as, so when I write my signature, it's different from everyone else's by how it looks.
No, that's cool.
Right. So that's how I think of it in my mind. I don't know if that's the actual reason,
Who cares?
but
it works.
it works, right?
No, yeah, that's
And honestly, no one really is going to quiz you on that. I might. But
Well, no,
I
I
won't.
just like expression and a binding. I'm like, how is that different? Okay, that's
Ah.
expression.
Yes.
Now I see. Okay. Thank you.
And functions can also be expressions.
I'm having a problem with the stream.
Oh, we are.
Yeah, Karen sent me a message and said that the video is just showing the message, "We'll be right back," but she can hear you.
Oh, yeah,
She can't
that's,
see the screen.
that is expected.
Hi,
Actually,
Karen.
is it?
How do I?
Let me see, hold on. Let me see my,
Do I need to set something up differently?
give me 1 second.
Sorry, remote viewers.
Can you say one more time? So you already said it. Wow, you think of a signature.
Yes. So the way I sign my name is different from everyone else's. Yep. I know it seems silly, but
No,
it really
no,
drives
I
things
think it's
home.
silly.
Yeah, I'm the type of person that likes things like I call it plain English.
Yeah.
Right. I don't use a lot of technical jargon.
Can you go to the slides real quick? I just want to see.
Yeah.
These updates.
Jeopardy music.
Can you hit the stop streaming button real quick?
Sure.
Just hit start again. See if that.
Shouldn't I see like my screen like going off?
Sometimes the screen gets frozen.
Oh,
Yeah, just hit the stop streaming button.
oh
And
stop
then-
streaming.
Yeah. All right. See if that will fix it.
If not, hopefully my voice is soothing. Actually, it's it's funny. I get whenever I call someone, people actually think I'm a woman because I have a very high pitched voice over the phone. So I get called Joy a lot. So, but that's okay.
Do you ignore them?
I just keep going
Yeah,
because I'm
right.
so used to it. It's like that's fine. I called for information. I just want the info. It doesn't matter my gender.
Ma'am, right.
Right. I guess Jesse, if you want to just let me know.
Yeah.
I don't want to hold it up too much, but
I was gonna say, so there's, are you doing slides after this out of curiosity? Because we can hear you, just can't see the slides for some reason. But we can figure it out after the break. I just don't want to hold up too much. So
Yeah.
it's okay with everyone on the stream. I don't think they can hear me right now. But Joey, if you could ping, I'll do it actually. I'll ping the slide link out, and you can just follow along audio for now. We'll fix the video after the break if that works for remote viewers. So you're good.
okay. I'm going to do something real quick. Hopefully this will work because it is Google to Google. I'm going to add a new slide. Add a new text box. All right, so at least these are in the slide. Very small, but they're there.
Thank you, Joey.
All right, so hopefully it helps. All right, so functions. Functions are good. We're going to be using them a lot. The other thing I want to talk about real quick, or ask how everyone feels about iteration, so loops. So just by show of hands, who's just, when I say the word, just raise your hand if you're familiar with it. So the for each,
Oh,
Right.
different types.
while loop, for loop, map, filter. Okay, good. I just wanted base. So we're going to learn map this week. We're also going to learn filter, and if we have time, reduce. These are all things that we'll probably cover the last day of this week. But just so you know, they are very powerful, and they are ways for you to iterate over data. And so we'll definitely be using them this week. We'll start with just simple fors and for eaches. Oh. Yeah.
Yeah, that's really
I also just shared this in the Slack channel.
Oh, cool. Excellent. There we go.
Perfect.
All right. So good. So today we'll discuss a little bit about working with JavaScript in the browser. One of the things I do want to highlight are some tools that are available. So everyone here is using Chrome, I take it? Okay, so let's open up a Chrome browser. And we're going to type Chrome extensions. And you should see the Chrome Web Store, -extensions, -Google Chrome. And we're just going to hold right there for a second. And if you hit Command-Option-J, we should see our developer tools. And it should, depending on what tab you are at, it's typically the console opens first. Has everyone used the console yet? Okay. So like I can write expressions in here, right? I can do all kinds of stuff. I can write JavaScript. Now, when you're working on projects related to the DOM, like everyone here understand the DOM. I have a basic understanding. So where your HTML nodes turn into actual, visualizations in the browser. When you're working with that, it helps to be able to interact with it, and we're going to learn how to do some of that if you haven't already done any of that. Have you guys worked with nodes yet, DOM nodes, or access them at all, or create them? Good, then I have some great content for you. I just don't want to repeat too much. Some repetition's okay, but I also want to introduce new concepts as well. When working with the DOM, we can access the various elements on our page through our console. But if we're developing a script and we want to do 20 different things, we don't want to write that out line by line by line in our console, right? So let's say if I wanted to do something with multi-line, I could write a function. I can do this my function again, and it will do several things. But still, you have to keep running that, right? You have to keep typing that out, and that's not very helpful. So I know everyone here, I believe, is using Visual Studio Code as well, so you're familiar with that, so that's great. What if we could take Visual Studio Code and use something like it in the browser to kind of interact with the DOM without having to refresh our pages over and over? And that's what I'm going to show you. I use this tool all the time. In fact, I used it today. Make this larger.
Yeah, make that
Yeah.
larger.
That is not the correct. There we go. It's different on a Mac than a PC, and 99% of my days on a PC. So apologize for inconsistencies like that. So in our store, we're going to type ScratchJS, one word. And you're going to want to add to Chrome. It's free. It doesn't do download any malware or anything like that. But this tool is very useful, and I will show you in just a moment why. Just let me know when you've got it. It only takes a minute, and your browser shouldn't have to reload. So, all right. ScratchJS. Sorry, this is a little small over here. Like a scratch pad. That's kind of exactly what it is. So it's a way for us to write some code without it going away just because you refreshed your browser. So when you may have to open a new tab to see the changes, but on the top of your developer tools, you should see an entry for ScratchJS. So does everyone see that?
No.
Not yet? Okay.
Close it and open it up again.
You had to close it and open it up? Okay, so maybe just restart your browser instance. So if you have open tabs, hopefully you don't have anything that you don't want to lose. So you may have to close the entire browser.
Oh, I might close
You
it.
just have to close the DevTools.
Is that all it took? Perfect.
It's a super nifty Chrome extension.
I installed this 3 years ago, so I forgot how many times I need to reload things.
Okay.
You'll see ScratchJS.
Oh.
Yeah, you'll have to open up your DevTools. If you don't have enough room, you'll see the two chevrons there. Oh, yeah, our logo at the bank included a Chevron, and that's when I first learned the term. I don't know. Yeah, it's like, so, you know what a Chevron is. They'll think you said Chevy. Yeah. Okay. You may just need to close the DevTools and reopen them.
Yeah,
So while oh, perfect. All right, so in Visual Studio Code, you can close the application and reopen it. As long as you saved your file, you retain your contents, right? So this is similar, where if you accidentally close the browser, the contents will remain. And that uses a technology called service workers, which if anyone wants to learn more about that later on in the week, we can touch on those as well. So service workers, yep, it's the basis of progressive web applications. So if anyone has any interest in that, we can talk about that later. Basically what it does, it remembers what is in there. I believe they use service workers for this. If not, it's some internal mechanism. But the concept is the same. So if I type stuff out, and I close this, it's not gone. Right? It remembers, which is very helpful when you're working with, like say, the DOM, right? So we want to be able to run some code and see how it's functioning and make sure we're doing everything right. But we won't lose our progress. All right. So what I'm going to do is show you real quick how this works. So if I write a function, again, I'll just use the my function thing. And all I'm going to do is I'm going to console log something. When I hit run, it's going to execute this script. So if I go down to the console, whatever I've declared, I will have access to. So I can actually start typing my func, and we can see that it's there. And if I execute it, I'm actually running that script. I can also declare variables. Pass in arguments. Run it. And then if I say my func can say something, it's just like I'm running it after I've saved it in Visual Studio Code, right? So I can execute this script. So this is going to be very helpful when you're working with the DOM or anything browser related. You can just run your scripts right in here and figure it out as you go along. You don't have to worry about going to another application, saving it, coming back, refreshing. You may still have to refresh your page depending on the script that you're writing, but it's all contained right here. And if you want to save it, it's just select all, copy, paste, there you go, you're done, right? Like I said, I use this tool all the time. It's very helpful. And if you want to use it today, you can. If you want to switch back and forth between Visual Studio, you can as well. But I just wanted to highlight that tool as a quick way to be, I guess, more productive, a little quicker. So back over to here, really fast. So that's one of our tools that we can use throughout this week. Evaluating JavaScript in the console, sounds like you guys got a good handle on that, so that's good. Browser extensions, and we basically just did all that. So the DOM, Document Object Model, has an API with it. What is an API? Does anyone want to give me a definition? Who has the definition?
I don't know if it's the right definition, but it's basically how you interact with a website.
Yes and no. Yeah. So API stands for Application Programming Interface. And the way I think about it is a bank teller. So if I go to the bank has my money. I need to get my money. but I need to access their API, which is the teller. So I go to the teller and I say, hey, I want to execute this withdrawal function. Give me my stuff, right? And then bang teller goes back to the big wheel, turns it, brings out a bag full of cash and hands it to me. And that's essentially how I think about an API, right? It's just a gateway to either other methods within that particular site or the data within it, right? It's just how we access data. So how do we access the DOM? We access it in a similar fashion. So the DOM has this API layer, and we can access it via JavaScript. And there are several ways to do that. So where do we find this? We find it. We can find it in our console. Let me just open up the console here. If I type the word window, hit enter, I'll see this object that's seemed to be frozen. That's odd. Maybe it doesn't like it on here. Let me go over here. Sorry about that. Yeah, I think I'm going to have to refresh this. 1 second. Oh, I can't type. Okay, there we go. So there's this concept of this window object, and that represents the entire window that you're looking at. So from this right side to this left side, top to bottom. That's your window, right? That's your viewport. So this window has this global object called window, and it has basically access to all the things that you can do within it. And one of those things is something called document. So this document represents the actual file that's loaded into your browser. And it's through that we can actually access the DOM. We can access the methods on it. We can create elements in the DOM. We can remove them. We can change them. So a window is this special thing, right? It also has a reference to itself. And it's one of those weird instances where there is no crash because it's this circular reference. It's always constantly referencing itself. It's this really strange way of doing it, but just so you know that does exist. But if I say window.document, this is my API. Well, this is actually the document, and I can access methods on this document through this API. So another way that you can access document is simply by typing document. It's the same thing. You don't have to type window first, because in the browser it assumes that if you are typing, whatever you are typing, you are trying to access something off of this window object. It is this global variable that exists out there that you can access all these things on. And so the first thing we'll do is remind myself where I'm at. I'll go back to here. Hopefully this, I won't type window again. It seems to not like that when I'm doing this. So we won't do that. So we can access DOM elements through this window object. We can manipulate them, and we can create and remove them. So how do we create and access these DOM elements? Well, let's first of all talk about accessing, because that's the slide I'm on. So what we'll do is, let's just go to, say, Google. We're already there. I just opened it. So I could say document dot, and then there's a whole bunch of ways that you can access elements. So have you guys done this before? Have you accessed elements at all in any of the HTML or anything? Right. So some of this is kind of a refresher. There's several ways I can access elements. I can access it by ID. So we're familiar with CSS selectors by now, right? We can access it by class name. Now when it says class name, but you're in CSS, you'll think class. That's the same thing, right? So class is a reserved word, so we can't access things by class. So if something is given a class, it's actually given a class name when you're accessing it through JavaScript. Just, it's the same thing. That's all you need to know. We can get it by name. So for example, the tag name, which would be like a div or a p tag or something like that, or by name. I never access it by name, but I believe that's for like form fields. So you can give a form field a name, and then you can reference it that way. You can also do it by ID. And tag name ns. I've never used that before, but we can explore. All right, so let's get element by tag name, and we'll just say div as a string, pass in a string. And this is going to give me a gigantic HTML collection type, array type object of 237 elements. Not exactly useful, right?
So it's all the divs on this Google page.
It's every single div on this page, which you'd think for just a small page like this, but a lot of this stuff is geared towards Google Analytics and stuff like that. Anyway, so that's how we access specific tags. So we get back this array-like thing, and we're familiar with arrays right now? Objects, arrays? Okay, perfect. We could also, let's take a look at elements. If we go to our Elements tab, we can actually see the DOM structure. So this one, this GBGD, that's a div. It's got a class. We can access it by class name. So let's do by class name, GB_GD. We get back one thing, but it's still this array-like thing, right? It's still a collection. You're always going to get that back. Now that's useful because if you get back more than one thing, you can iterate over them, so you can loop over them. Or if you always expect the one thing and you don't care about anything else that comes after it, you can always just access the first element. So depending how you want to do it. Get elements by class name, parens, and this is just a string of the class name I want to find.
You can just like enlarge that just a little bit.
Yeah. Looks good?
Yeah, that's better.
Ooh, that's a little bit. All right. So how do we access that first element? Use square brackets, and now we're accessing an index. We want the first one, and since this is 0-based, we say 0. And now we actually have, this is the actual DOM element. So there's things on here that we can access as well, right? So we know that there is a class name. So I have access to these values. This is useful when you're trying to find specific things. And there's another way that you can access these that's becoming a lot more common. So has everyone here heard of jQuery? Was that touched upon? So browsers now have a jQuery-like interface to them, so you don't necessarily have to load in jQuery. And what we would say is we say document.querySelector. And just like with jQuery, we pass it in a CSS selector. So if I wanted the class GBGD, say dot GBGD, now I have that element. So you don't need to load in extra libraries just to be able to select things. And there's also query selector all. So if I want everything that's just a div again, I would just type in div, query selector all, and I get back again 237 things that I don't want to go through. So these are ways that we can access these elements. And why is this useful? Well, if we want to manipulate that element, we can access it that way. Let's try to find an element that's clear. So like this input box, which actually has fake box dash container. So let's access that. It's an ID. That's a unique identifier. You're pretty much guaranteeing that there's nothing else on that page that has the ID of fake box dash container. So let's access that. So we'll say document.getElementById. And the nice thing about Chrome is that it likes to autocomplete for you, so you can just hit tab and you got the rest of it. Because then you end up misspelling things like I always do. And then we'll say fake box dash container. No, didn't like that. Interesting. I spelled it wrong? Let's do it this way. Okay. We'll do it the new fun way. Query selector, say input. So there we have it. Now if you notice, if I hover over it, you'll see in the document it's actually highlighting. So whenever you reference an element in the DOM, it is a quote-unquote live reference. So you are accessing it like in real time. So if I ever want to change anything about this, like say give it a better ID, I could say .id equals better ID. And then you'll notice something changed up here. I'm not going to go too much into that, but it won't let me. Oh, there we go. Here's our input. If I select that input, you'll see right here, it's kind of small, but there. Now it has a new ID. So you can change the properties of these elements on the fly, which is handy if you want to manipulate the DOM based on, say, user input or any type of user interaction, or maybe something finally loaded and you want to actually populate those elements with data. This is one way to do that. Let's see, another way to, let me make sure I'm on track. Query selector all. There's lots of ways to select things. Oh, before I forget, I keep doing that, sorry. Another nice thing about working in the console or within ScratchJS, whichever, is that let's say I want to manipulate something, but I want to do it after something else happens, right, as a result of something. So what I can do is I can save. I can save that element to that element reference to a variable. Query selector. Now this should work because I gave it a new ID. No, still didn't like it. There we go. That's better. Oh, because I spelled it wrong. Let me just redo that. I know it works. There we go. All right. Now this is saved to a variable. I can access it at any time I want. Right? So if I have a function that accepts something to be changed, I can now pass this into that function, and then that function can take care of changing that thing for me. So if we go over to ScratchJS, and we'll get rid of this example code, and we'll just create a function called changeID. That seems useful. We'll take in a DOM node. We can call this variable anything we want. And then what we'll do is we'll say node.id. Oh, and we also want to be able to pass in what we want that new ID to become, right? So I can give it another parameter. And I can say node.id equals ID. That's all this function does. It sets the ID property to whatever you pass in as the second argument. So now if I run this, and I go down here, and I start typing change ID, you'll see that it's there. And this is a terrible page to do this on. It keeps re-rendering. It keeps trying to access something, one of their scripts. So it keeps seeing these funky things in the console. All right. So what I'll do is go back. So I still have my input. I still have a reference to this variable. So var input equals the query string or the query selector. And we could just type input if you don't want to. All right, so let's start, kind of quote unquote start over. We don't have a reference to input. Now if we type change ID, and we pass in our input, we pass in the new ID we want to give it, maybe Swiss cheese. Now all we have to do is check our element here. You can see it's got a new ID. So, and we can keep doing this, right? Now it's Swiss cheese 1, 2, 3, right? ABC mouse 1, 2, 3, or whatever it is. Now it's Swiss cheese 1, 2, 3. So whenever you save a reference to an element, it is quote unquote a live reference. So you're accessing it as long as that script's still there and as long as that page is still there. So if I go to another page and I come back, that's gone, right? That's not preserved or persisted. So these are very helpful ways of accessing. Oops. That's not the password. Now this may seem trivial, but the more you do it, the more it'll just become ingrained. You have a question?
I don't know yet.
Okay.
My brain's working.
All right. So that's how we can select things. We can save references to them.
Going back to the screen, just for everyone.
Yeah. Oh, for this?
Yeah, to change
Yep.
out the if it's switch to Java, that's what I was.
Gotcha.
Thank you.
Yep. Good. Okay. So we've already kind of seen one way to manipulate an element. We can access the attribute name. So this syntax, if you're not familiar with this syntax, this is just the way I write things, but it's, if you have square brackets and you put in, let's say, a variable name, it's going to resolve that. It's going to, I think that's the right term. It's going to resolve to whatever the value is of that variable. So in the same way that you access, I keep doing that. If I say var my array equals 1, 2, and 3. So in the same way that we could say my array and put in 2, I know I'm going to get the third element, right? So when you see documentation this way, just know that whatever's in the brackets, that represents something, not necessarily exactly what you're doing. So if I say element and then square brackets attribute name, that's the same way of saying input and then ID. Did you guys go over that at all? With like evaluate, that's what evaluating. Variables and square brackets. Okay. So just as a heads up, when I write things out, you'll see me do that all the time. Just don't want to confuse anyone. So input brackets ID is the same as saying input dot ID, right? So, but there's other things you can do inside here, like we can put dashes, whereas you can't actually do this because it's actually going to try to subtract it, right? So it's an operation. So special characters like that you can't use after the dot notation. So just as a heads up. But if you need to, or even if there's spaces, because sometimes you can actually use spaces in certain situations, that has to be a string. This space is actually a character, and it recognizes that character. So that's why it looks like there's a space, but it's really, to JavaScript, it's just another character inside of a string. But the string itself is the value. Okay? What questions do you have so far? On anything so far? Are we going too slow? Too fast? We good? Good? Okay, cool. So let's move right along. Okay, so also another ways to manipulate DOM elements. We can set attribute and remove attribute. Let's just get rid of this. So we still have our input here. Yep. So let's say I wanted to get rid of the type equals URL. I could just say input dot remove attribute. And now if I reference this again, see that's gone. or if I need to add an attribute, I can use the set attribute method. And we'll give it a type. Set attribute takes two arguments. First one is the property you want to add or set. Not necessarily add, but set. And the next one is the value you want to give it. So instead of URL, we'll say, I don't know, web page. That's not really valid, but that's okay. It's going to do it anyway. This is really useful when you want to have, you can embed data inside of DOM elements, right? So if I have this input and I want to embed some extra data into it, typically the way you would do that is you say set attribute, and the first parameter we're going to say data dash, and then the name of that type of data, right? So we could say data dash ID, or we could say data dot name, whatever it happens to be. If you're using custom attributes, it's highly encouraged that you do not use a native attribute name, but actually use something like data dash. It's a common pattern for embedding data. And I could just say, or whatever your name happens to be. And then inside input, we'll see data dash name, and that'll have that data. So you can embed stuff like that. A lot of the stuff, you typically won't be doing this a lot in your day-to-day. There's a lot of things with front-end frameworks that do all of this stuff for you, and we'll be covering that in a later module as well. But just so you know, underneath the hood, it's doing these types of things. And it's doing it a lot more efficiently than I'm doing it. But that's okay. This is just illustrating the point. I should just turn this on. And we'll go over it. All right, so setting attributes, removing attributes, fairly easy, right? More things we can do. We can create elements from scratch. So let's create an element, and we'll be doing this later in our exercises as well. So it's a good thing to go over this. When we want to create an element, we would say document.create element, and then we give it the name of that type of element. So I could just say div. And I've created an element. Unfortunately, I cannot use this. I've created it, but I didn't do anything with it, right? So if I wanted to do something with it, I want to save it off. So I'd say var div equals document.create element. Now I have continued access to it. Now I can manipulate it, I can set attributes, I can change it any way I want. So I could say div, because now I have a reference to that actual element. I could say ID equals my awesome div, because it's great. Oops. So now when I access div, I see that property on there. And I can remove it and change it the same way. But that doesn't do me a whole lot of good either, right? So I have this div in the console, it's floating around in this window thing, and we need to put it somewhere, right? We need to, so one nice way of working with kind of like a blank slate is if you go up to your URL, you type about:blank, you get a blank document. Did everyone see that? So about:blank. The really nice thing about this is if you go over to the Elements tab in your DevTools, you have the necessary structure for an HTML document. So you don't have to worry about creating the HTML tag or the head tag or the body tag. It's there. That's what about:blank does. It just gives you a blank document. This doesn't conform to any rules. It's just a bunch of tags that you can utilize. I don't recommend creating actual web pages this way, but in essence, that's what we're doing. So let's go back and let's create that div again. Nice thing about the console is we can just hit up until we get to what we want. So var div equals document create element. So now we have this div. That's great. There's other thing, just a div by itself, are we going to be able to see it? No, of course not. It's blank. So we can set some attributes. So let's set an attribute of style. And you could just give it a string of CSS. So we'll just say color, well, maybe not color, maybe background color would be better. Background color, we'll say blue. Awesome. And then we'll say, actually, let's do a little bit more. Let's actually give it some height and width, otherwise we won't see it either. So we'll say a height of 100 px. Separate these out by semicolons. We'll give it a width of 100 px, or whatever width and height you want to give it. Great. So we have this div. It's got some attributes. We still don't see it because we have to push it into the DOM. So how we do that is we say document dot, and then we'll put it in the body. Say document dot body. We'll say append child. So if you remember back from HTML, each element has the opportunity to become a parent. That's fantastic, right? They can have kids. Even HTML elements can have kids. So a child is anything that is inside of itself, or inside of this particular element. So if I say document.body append child, I need to pass it in the thing I want to append. So I'll just pass in my reference to div. Voila, I have a blue square. Real simple, of course, but illustrates the point. So I now have a live reference to this thing. So I can just say div.setAttribute. And maybe I want to change, the background color. Background color, we'll change it to green. What do you think's going to happen? Gone. It's green though. But every time you set an attribute, you are setting that entire attribute. So before we set it as a string with all those different CSS properties in it.
So that just deleted like the width and height.
Yes, it replaced that properties value with what we gave it. So if I wanted to continue to do that, rather than me typing all of that out again, I'm just going to say background green. And now it's green. Right? So just remember that there are certain attributes, if you just set them, you will replace them completely. And it may make a big difference in how you're rendering things to the DOM. All right. So we can append child. We can also quote unquote prepend. I don't know why they didn't call it prepend. It makes sense to me, but they call it InsertBefore. So let's create another one. It does make sense once we start using it. Let's create a new one. We'll say var div2, because I am very creative in my naming. Say document.create element div. So we create a new div. Say div2 dot. In fact, I'll just do this. I'll just replace this with this. I just don't want to have to type all that out again. So you can set another attribute. We'll give it yellow as the color. And we want this to come before the element that is prior, or that already exists. So we can say document.body.insert before. And we're going to tell it which element we want to insert before it. And then the second parameter, it does take two parameters, is the element we want to inject. No, that is not it. Document.InsertBefore. I probably have it swapped. I don't. Hold on a second. This is a great opportunity, actually, to highlight another reference. I don't know if you've had access to it yet. MDN, Microsoft Development Network. Great. This is actually planned. I plan to do this. I'm only half joking. I did plan on doing this, just not so soon. Anyway, so we're going to say MDN, and we're going to say what we want to look up. So we want to say InsertBefore. And we transport it away to the lovely results for Mozilla Developer Network. insert before. So node.InsertBefore. Great. So we want to figure out what's going on here. So we have a parent node, insert before the new node, and then the reference node. Okay, great. So the node being inserted, that is inserted node, the parent of the newly inserted node, the node to be inserted, and a reference. We probably don't need the reference, but that's okay. So let's see what that looks like. We can actually do this. We'll go over to Scratch. Another nice thing about Scratch is you can just plug in some stuff and you have a nice little scratch pad even just for documentation. Oh, that's right. I started a new browser tab, didn't I? All right. So I want all of this, actually. We'll figure this out together. So MDN is one of those great resources that I use constantly. I don't remember everything. I would be hard-pressed to find anyone that does remember everything. Unless you have an eidetic memory, then you're lucky or unlucky. So here we have a nice little reference here. So let's make sure that we still have our references to our different things. Very good. So document dot. Probably using this wrong. That's okay. So we'll say new node. We'll just go right off the documentation, and we'll say parent node, which is document dot. Oh, actually, no, we want div. That's parent node insert before. Oh, that's right. Document dot body dot insert for the new node, which is div2, the reference node, div. There we go. Helps when you type it out right. So there's various ways, this is just to illustrate that there's various ways to create elements, insert that into the DOM, and now you have this live reference to these things, right? So I could say new node, and you'll notice here, if I hover over that IM ref, you'll see it highlighted over there in the DOM. So now I can access those properties, change them, and so on and so forth. Right, so we can also create a text node. You could probably imagine what that's going to do. But let's do that. So down here we'll say, and this is more of an important point here. So we'll say var text equals document dot create text node, and then we want to give it some data. So we'll just say whatever you want to put in there, or my div, or DMV. So now I have this text node. So this text node is treated as a node. It's not just some text floating around, and it has properties as well. But I want to insert that into one of these divs. So then I would say div dot, we'll put it in the green one, Append Child. And now it's inside there. Probably not the best choice. So let's do this. We'll say div2. Anything's going to happen now. I don't have the other one anymore. So when you create a reference to an element, there can only be one of that element, right? Inside, there may be lots of divs, but each one of those divs has its own reference. So when you save an element to a variable as a reference, and you change its you change where it is in the DOM, it doesn't show up where it used to, right? There can only be one of them. The DOM knows that, and so if you do what we just did, and we just change where we wanted it to go, it's going to remove it from where it was and put it where you told it to go. So you can only ever have one of them. Multiples of the same, but only ever one of each. So that's just as a heads up. is the end of my slides. All right, so any questions so far?
Yeah, I didn't get any of that to work.
Oh, okay.
That's not really a question, just a statement.
Well, we can fix that. Which part?
Making the box.
Making a box. All right, so let's make a new box. So we'll give it a new reference name. We'll just say a blue box. I'm actually typing right in the console.
Gotcha.
Yep. And this new blue box is going to be document, or the result of calling document.createElement. We'll pass in a string of div. That's the type of element that we want. Fantastic. Now if I type blue box dot set attribute, okay, so we want to set the attributes on it. And the first parameter is the attribute name. In this case, it'll be style. The second one is the value of that style, and this is just CSS in this case. So we'll just say background color is blue, or light blue. So that sounds a little better. Light blue. Width, we'll do another 100 pixels, and height. So all the properties I want to have on this thing. Hit enter, and now we have that. Now we can actually append it to our DOM. We'll say document.body.append child, or wherever you want to append it to. If I were to append this inside the green div, it would completely overwrite what you see because it's the same height and width, so we'll just put it afterwards. So document.body.append child, and pass in our blue box. And now we have our element on the screen. Do I need to increase the font size?
Yeah.
Okay. Pedal tours. Fantastic background noise. So glad our young adults are having so much fun out there. Let's hope they are safe. Okay. We can write an app, right? Check their safety. Young adult safe app. So do we have, are we all set there? Let's just check real quick to see. Oh, so when you declare the variable, you can
Yeah.
capitalize the B.
Oh, the second page?
So just when you reference it from now on, just keep the same capitalization. Yeah, so when you're creating variables, case matters. In this particular language, some languages it does not. SQL doesn't particularly care, but SQL doesn't care about you. I use it all day long. Not all day long. I try not to use it all day long. But I've learned to not like it so much. It's a necessary evil where I am. All right. But you're also going to learn about different types of database stuff in an upcoming module that I feel is better than SQL in some ways. So you'll be privy to that. All right. Any questions on this? All right. Cool. So are we at a good break point? Okay. All right, so we'll just take a quick break, and then we'll come back and we'll start actually doing some useful things with these methods. All right? Yep. I'm just going to hit BRB.